Welcome to How the Internet Dodged a Bullet. My name is Elias Heftrich, and I'm here with one of my co-authors, Niklas Vogel, and we're going to present our works on the KeyTrap denial of service attacks against DNSSEC, which is a class of resource exhaustion attacks which cause denial of service. First, we'll get into one mode concerning DNS and DNSSEC, a short refresher. And first, we'll ask us our question, why is it always DNS? And we all know it's always DNS. We've seen in the keynote, for instance, that the 2021 Facebook outage happened, and it also was due to DNS. And the reason for that is, why it's always DNS, is that DNS is a very mission-critical protocol on the internet. So virtually every transaction is preceded a DNS lookup, in which a domain name gets resolved to an IP address, and therefore DNS is very important. So let's have a look how DNS resolution works. We have our client. The client sends a query to a resolver asking for the address record he wants to resolve. The resolver will then, assuming nothing is in its cache, forward that query to the root servers. The root name servers will then respond with a referral to the next closest name servers, in that case a second level domain server, which will then be queried by the resolver for the very same records, itself respond with a referral response, until eventually the resolver is delegated to the name server which is actually authoritative for the records the client asked for. The server will then deliver these records to the resolver, and the resolver will forward them back to the client. DNS is a very old protocol, and it has been created without much security in mind, because when the internet was young, there wasn't much concerns about security. And a very old attack and very critical attack against DNS is DNS poisoning, which is an attack on DNS record authenticity. Here in this example, the attacker injects poisonous values into the communication between the resolver and the authoritative name server, which will then lead to the client being delivered poisonous values and being redirected to the attacker in turn. To prevent that, DNSSEC has been standardized in the late 90s, and DNSSEC uses signatures over the records. The resolver validates these signatures and establishes trust in the signatures by means of a public key infrastructure, which is aligned with the DNS hierarchy. And this prevents the attack. DNSSEC is a little IPv6 story, so it shares some similarities in terms of adoption. Adoption in domains is quite dragging. On the top-level domain side, it actually looks rather good, so we have about 6% of them not being signed. But on the second-level domain side, it's much worse, so there's essentially the other way around. Only about 7% of them are signed. On the resolver side of things, so validating DNSSEC looks quite a bit better. So if you take, for instance, the IPv4 address space and select all those IPv4 addresses which do DNS resolution, about a quarter of them also does DNSSEC validation. And if you conduct studies using web clients, for instance using ad networks, which is something we did, you see that about a third of the web clients worldwide are protected by resolvers which do validate DNSSEC. So, but how does it work? Let's assume we are a resolver, or using a terminal for that matter, so it doesn't make a big difference. We're taking the perspective of a resolver now, and we're asking, what is the IP address of www.ietf.org? Our response looks something like this. Here we got our IPv4 addresses, 2 of them. These addresses are contained in resource records, and these resource records form a set. A set is being defined as having the same name, class, and type. Type is the IPv4 address records, name is the one we queried, and the class is a little anachronistic, so it's always the internet essentially. You could define other scopes with it, but it's virtually done. So we asked also for DNSSEC records, so we get our signature records as well. The signature records carry the signature and are associated with the record set by means of the name, the class, and a type covered field, which is contained in the record data. So, but how is the signature now validated? To validate the signature, we also need a key, obviously, and what we're doing now is also what the resolver does. We're querying for the DNS key set in that domain. We get back the DNS key set carrying public keys. And the set is itself signed and covered by a signature record. So now we have signatures and keys, but how are they associated? Again, we have our 2 responses here, signatures and keys, and we'll just forget about everything which is not important here. And now we have the signer name, which is a field in the signature record, and the signer name needs to equal the name of the DNS key record, which is the name of the domain we got our records from. The algorithm number must match, so DNSSEC uses multiple algorithms. You can select between them, and obviously you cannot evaluate an RSA signature with ECDSA key. And the signature record also has a key tag field, which lists 16-bit number. Note that the DNS key record does not feature such a field. So the key tag is then calculated as a 16-bit checksum over the record data and not conveyed in a field. So having calculated the key tag, we now can use the triple of the owner name equals signer name and algorithm number and key tag to associate a signature with a key. Speaking of keys, we measured and found that DNS keys in top-level domains, for instance, are usually less than 4. And 1 or 2 is the most common case on the internet, and it's essentially the same in all domains that we measured. So the least domains online are using more than 4 keys. The reason behind that is transport requirements to keep DNS efficient. What's also efficient here is the association of keys and signatures, because they're only at max 4 keys commonly, and so this mechanism is very efficient under normal conditions. But we're not here to show you normal conditions, we're here to show you an attack, which is our KeyTrap attacks. So let's check back and see how the association of signatures with keys works. We now have our key tag, which is matching, but what happens if key tags collide in the DNS key set? So now we have both the name, the algorithm number, and the key tag, which is all the same for multiple DNS keys. And this can actually happen, and therefore the protocol also included a mechanism to deal with that. So first of all, resolvers and implementations, validators must not assume that the key tag uniquely identifies the DNS key. And if it's the case that this whole triple is not unique, then the validator cannot really select between one, but must, by means of specification, try all of them until it runs out of keys to try or found a pair of keys and signatures which validates. So this requirement ensures robustness, which is very important in DNSSEC, because if you have a misconfiguration on the domain side and something goes wrong in that configuration, then all subdomains are not reachable as well. And this is also a very old requirement, so this is seen first in the 1999 specification already, so it's very central for DNSSEC. But it's a little strange, right? We have a linear time algorithm over resource-intensive public key cryptography operations, and a resolver really must try all keys. I mean, this must, capital must, this is RC lingo for either you do it or you don't abide by specification requirements. Sounds a little like a bad idea, right? But there was more. There was another requirement, and there is another requirement, this is up-to-date specification, that a resolver should try all signatures covering a record set. So in case there are multiple and one does not really validate, it does not work because it has been created with an outdated key or whatever, all the signatures need to be tried until the resolver runs out of signatures to try or finds one which validates. Again, this is meant to ensure robustness in face of validation errors or attacks. This requirement is from 2013, so it has been introduced a little later. In the end, we now have not a linear time algorithm over cryptography, but actually a quadratic one. And if we have a look at the implementations, we also see that the validation routine of open source resolvers, in this case it's Unbound, are actually doing this. So here in this case, we have an outer signature loop where Unbound tries all the signatures until it finds one which matches, and an inner key loop where Unbound tries all the keys matching this triple until it finds a key which matches. So the validation routine is quadratic. Doesn't look good, but that also does not really imply an attack already. So there could be limited buffers or other mitigations in place. So if we want to attack Unbound or any other resolver for that regard, we need to construct an attack. To do this, we first must find out how much can all actually be. And if we have a look at the protocol, we find there's not many restrictions in DNS. We have our DNS message header here on the right side, which limits the records in a section to the power of 16 minus 1, so 16-bit counter. And So DNS key and signature records must be conveyed in the same message and even in the same section for that regard to work. So record sets in DNS must not be split across multiple sections or even multiple messages. So in the end, our bottleneck here is the length specifier from the transport layer, which is 16 bits. And that's the same for all the transport protocols which have been specified for DNS. So if we do the math, size of a DNS message is about 64K. One DNS key record, algorithm 13, is 80 bytes. That leaves us space for 820 signature records, keys per response. Speaking of signatures, one signature record is about 110 bytes. Again, doing the math, about 600 of them per response. If we multiply that, keys times signatures, we end up with 490,000 validations per single response. Now let's assume one signature validation takes 150 microseconds. And again, doing the math, we end up with 74 seconds calculation time for one set of signatures in a single response. Quite a bit. Okay, so now we know how many DNS keys and signatures we can fit into one response. Let's construct an attack. First, we need to have the DNS keys, and for that matter, a very large set of DNS keys, which all conform for the same key tag. And we're doing this in a pretty straightforward fashion. We just select one key tag and roll dices, generate a lot of keys until we have enough of them to put into our responses, which all conform to the same key tag. In the end, our zone file looks something like this. Here we have the subset of keys, which is matching. So first, it has different public keys. This is relevant because all the keys, the signature records, the records in one set must not be the same because it's a set and sets are deduplicated. So we have different public keys, all that we dice rolled before. And all the records conform to the same key tag. And for resolvers to actually accept that, we also need another signature over the key set, which is efficiently validated with a separate DNS key, which has a separate key tag and can be found efficiently. So now we want to have signatures, and signatures need to cover something. For that matter, we have IPv4 address, a single record, put into our zone file, and then we have a lot of signatures covering it. This is the record, just some random IPv4 address, and a whole lot of signatures, all pointing to the same owner name, ID number, and key tag. The signatures themselves are actually cryptography invalid, which is important, but mathematically, on the syntactic side, syntactically they are valid. So we took a prototype record and just created a signature over it so that the validation routine runs as long as possible before the validator notices, okay, this doesn't work out. And again, to prevent deduplication, we just went and changed the timestamps for validity to introduce variability in the set. And all you can see here is repeated all over the place in our zone file. So there's not just one IPv4 address record, but multiple of them, so that we can then go on and query multiple records. Okay, we've set up our zone file. Now we want to attract a victim resolver. Straightforward way to do this would be just querying it directly. But commonly on the internet, resolvers, there are quite a few which you could actually query directly, but oftentimes there's a firewall blocking access to it. Our attacker knows ways around this. For instance, the attacker could send an email to a victim domain with a non-existent mailbox, and if the mail server is configured to deliver bounce messages, the mail server will then go on and look up the sender domain, which is the attacker domain, to deliver this bounce message saying, hey, I got an email to a mailbox which I don't know. Other ways would be, for instance, sending HTML email to victim network so that the client opens the email and includes, say, images, for instance, which can be shown or not, or can be big or not, doesn't matter. So all this inclusion of external resources in the HTML will then trigger a lot of DNS requests to the victim resolver, which will then query the attacker domain. All this can also be scaled up, because in the end, DNS is a very open protocol, so firewall doesn't really help, as we've seen. DNS resolvers are not meant to be run in isolation. And the attacker can also scale this up quite a little because, as we've seen, we only have static zone data to serve, and it's not even much. So it's much in terms of a single DNS transaction, but it's not much in terms of common DDoS. It's just 64K per signature response. And to scale up the attack, the attacker could use other mechanisms, for instance, distributing online ads, again with HTML, including external resources, or also internet measurement networks could be abused. In this example, we see RIPE Atlas. The attack procedure now is rather straightforward. The attacker just sends multiple queries to the resolver. The resolver will then go on and fetch all the data from the attacker domain and run hot at CPU and cease responding. So this is flooding the victim resolver with malicious queries. And we also brought you a demo to show you how it works. So I assume you can see this. We got on the right side here is our resource monitor, which shows us CPU utilization. It's around 10% right now. And below that, there's memory consumption, but this is flatlining all the time. This is not a memory-based attack. And here on the left side, on the lower left, we have probing requests for benign domain, which are running 2 of them per second. We set a timeout of 500 milliseconds, which isn't a lot, but doesn't really matter. It's just for demonstration purposes. Usual timeouts are about 5 seconds, and in this attack, as I said, doesn't really matter. So now we're running our attack, and we see this is just one query for the attacker domain from our victim resolver, which is a Power DNS recursor. The attacker started. We see instantaneously, after 500 milliseconds, our benign queries get timeouts and fail, and our CPU is pinned at 100%. And this will go on for some seconds, which I'm not showing you because it can be minutes, can be more. Nicholas has a few words on that later. This runs until the resolver has validated all the signatures and found that none of the signatures work with any of the keys. So I've showed you the key SIG-trap attack, which is an instance of our KeyTrap attacks. We also have others. There's SIG-jam, which is just using the signature records for attack. LogCram, which is using only the colliding DNS key set with individual signatures. That's a little academic distinguishment, but we show by that you could exploit all the individual requirements in the RFCs alone. So, of course, key SIG-trap is the combined attack, which is the most powerful, but all the individual aspects work as well. And then we've also brought HashTrap, which is essentially key SIG-trap, but not with signature records. Instead, key SIG-trap uses DS records, which are used to link between a parent and a child domain. And these DS records don't use public key crypto, but only hashes, so naturally they're not as effective. And if you want to know more, you're pointed to our publication, which we have linked on the last slide. Speaking of effectiveness, I would like to hand over to my co-author, Niklas. Thank you. The stage is yours.
OK, thank you, Elias. Right, so we have now seen how the attack works, how it exploits keys and signatures to cause a lot of load on the resolver. But now let's take a short step back and look at how we can maximize the impact of this attack. And for this, we have to look at the DNSSEC algorithms. So DNSSEC supports multiple different cryptographic algorithms. And since the size of the message is limited, it turns out that size actually matters here. And actually, the smaller the better, right? Because the smaller the keys and the smaller the signatures, the more we can fit into one message. And the more validations we can induce in the resolver. But it turns out that this is not the whole story. So when we tested this in our lab, we found that different algorithms produce different loads per key bit. And elliptic curve are much better suited because they are producing much more load on the resolver than RSA-based algorithms. And therefore, we used elliptic curve in all of our evaluations. And with this, now let's come to one of the most exciting parts in the presentation, which is the evaluations of the attack. And for this, we created a local isolated setup on our machine. And we set up the unbound DNSSEC resolver. And we also set up a server running an attacking client. And what the attacker is doing, it requests a domain from unbound to resolve, and this domain is attacker controlled. So Unbound now has to go to the DNS server, download all the zone data, validate the data, and then can reply to the client if this domain could be resolved, maybe the IP address, or if maybe resolution failed. And we also set up additional monitoring on Unbound to check how it reacts to our attacks. And with this, now let's come to the first variant of our attack, which is a smaller version that just exploits many signatures with one key. And in this setup, we send 10 requests per second to Unbound, all requesting unique domains to ensure that the records are not cached. And then Unbound will have to go to our DNS server, and for each of these requests, download our zone data. And in this first attack, we constructed a zone that has 340 signatures that all map to the same DNS key. So they all have colliding key tags. And what happens now is that Unbound will have to validate through all these signatures before it can conclude that the request is invalid and can't be resolved. Which means that if we have 10 requests per second, then the resolver will have to do 3,400 validations before it can reply to the client per second. And the impact of this we can see on the next slide. So here I have a plot of the monitoring of Unbound. And the plot on the x-axis shows the time of the measurement. And on the y-axis, we see CPU load and the lost packets. And if you can look at the graph here, you can see that as soon as the attack starts, CPU load immediately spikes to 100%, which is also what we saw in the demo. And since the fan is still running, I assume it's still, the attack is still running. So it immediately spikes to 100% because Unbound is so busy validating through all these signatures. And at the same time, all benign traffic to the resolver is completely lost. So we have 100% packet loss on the resolver. And that's already a huge problem, right? Because we have a full denial of service attack, which only requires 10 requests per second, which is totally viable. Like 10 requests per second will not land you usually in any rate limiting. So this is already a complete attack. And this is the smaller variant, right? We didn't test the full attack yet. So since this is Black Hat, we of course brought something worse, which is the biggest attack that we have, which we called KeyTrap. And this attack now exploits many signatures and many keys. And the setup is very similar to the previous setup, with one important distinction. Instead of sending 10 requests per second, we now just send one single request. And that is not per second, it's just one request. And then the same thing happens. Unbound will have to go to our DNS server to resolve this single request. And in the zone, we now have, again, the 340 signatures, but we also have 582 keys. And they all have colliding key tags. So what will happen now? If Unbound follows specification, it will have to validate each of these signatures against each of these keys, so creating a quadratic amount of validations. And if we do the math here, we can see that Unbound will have to do over 220,000 validations just from this single request. So again, over 200,000 validations just from a single attacker request. And now let's see how the resolver takes this. As it turns out, not so good. So CPU load immediately again spikes to 100%, and also lost packets immediately spikes to 100%. And this attack from a single request keeps running for 18 entire minutes. So just from one single attacker request, which the request is about 100 bytes, we can DOS the resolver for 18 entire minutes. And keep in mind, this doesn't mean the resolver is DOS'd just for the attacker. It is DOS'd for any other person, any other client using the same resolver. So you can imagine what happens if someone used this on a Google resolver, for example. And when we did this measurement, we thought, okay, maybe Unbound is an outlier, right? Maybe this is just very bad on Unbound. Maybe it doesn't work on the others. So we set up the others, and we tried. And as it turns out, every single DNSSEC resolver that we tested is vulnerable to this. And when you think about it, it's actually not too surprising, because the vulnerability is in the standard. It's within the RFCs. And so if the resolvers are doing what they are supposed to do, if they implement a standard, if they follow the requirements, they are vulnerable. And actually, we couldn't test all of the resolvers, because some of the resolvers are closed source, like the public resolvers, like Cloudflare, like Google. And we couldn't test them because we didn't really feel like running live attacks on production software used by millions of people. And we also like to not be in prison. So we didn't test this on live production, but we talked to them and we asked them, and they confirmed to us that they are vulnerable. And now if you look at this table, you can see that we have two very notable outliers. And the first one is Bind, which is also the most used DNS resolver. And when we tested this on Bind initially, we started the attack, and it just kept on running. Like, the attack, it was still validating, still stalled, until the workday was over, so we had to stop it. And then on the next day, we started it again, and then we let it run. And it turned out that Bind was stalled for 16 hours, which is a big problem. And when we checked, the reason for this is that they have quite an inefficient key selection routine when you have colliding DNS keys. And when you think about it, you can't really blame them for it, because this is just something that won't happen in normal operation, and so they just didn't optimize for it. And that's usually not a problem, but in the attack it is, and so they were very much affected by the attack. Then another notable outlier is the not resolver, which is stalled for a shorter duration. I mean, it's still 50 seconds, it's still a big attack, but it's much shorter than the rest. And when we investigated this, and we talked to the developers, we found that this is caused by a limited buffer for DNS keys. So we just couldn't fit as many keys in our attack request. And talking to the developers, it turned out that this was actually a bug. This wasn't intentional. So they just did some miscalculations in the implementation. So the buffer was too small, and so not all the DNS keys could fit in it. But when they fixed this bug, the attack worked the same as in the others. So I guess, yeah, they failed successfully. Now, when we evaluated this, we chose a setup which was comparable. So we set up all resolvers on a single thread. And of course, this is not really a totally realistic deployment scenario, because in most deployments, you will have multiple threads, right? Depending on the deployment, you might have between maybe 4 and 32 threads. And so we also had to test how our attack works if we have multi-threading enabled. And for this, we set up Unbound again, and this time with 5 validation threads enabled. And then we sent 5 KeyTrap requests to the resolver and check what happened. And it turns out that the scheduling between requests and validation threads is not totally deterministic, and they also don't consider the load of the thread when scheduling, which means that if you send 5 requests and have 5 threads, usually you won't hit all of the threads. And you can see this here in the example, that only 4 of the 5 threads were hit, because it spikes to 80%, but not to 100%. So one validation thread is still open to reply to benign traffic. And you can also see that at the red arrow, it goes down for 3 of the threads, and one thread keeps on validating, because that's the thread that was hit by 2 of the requests, whereas one wasn't hit at all. And now learning from this, and learning from other experiments we did, we can construct a final attack, which is a comprehensive and persistent denial of service. And this attack only needs about a few packets per minute on any of the DNSSEC resolvers we tested, and achieves a complete, comprehensive, persistent DOS. So by just sending a few packets per minute, you can disable the resolver for anyone using it permanently. OK, now we have seen how detrimental this attack is, and a cute cat. And now let's talk about the impact that this would have if it would be exploited in the wild. Like, what would have happened if someone would have found this and exploited this before it was patched? And for this, to get a sense of how big the impact is, we use a measurement by Apnic, who just measure how many clients in the internet use a DNS resolver that is DNSSEC-validating. And since we want to use DNSSEC for the attack, we must look at how many clients actually use DNSSEC. And depending on which metric you use, you come to between 33 and 42% of global internet clients using a DNS resolver that validates DNSSEC. And since all resolvers that we tested, which was all that we could find, were vulnerable, we assume that basically all of these clients would be vulnerable to our attack. And so therefore, this means that if someone would have exploited this on a wider scale, they could have potentially disabled DNS services for over 1/3 of global internet users. And if you disable DNS for 1/3 of global internet users, you also disable most internet services for them, right? If you think about web browsing, or if you think about email, instant messaging, all of them use DNS, and if DNS is not available, then they can't use it. Okay, and also one interesting thing to note here is that the more protected a country is, so the greener it is on this map, for example, we're from Germany, and Germany has quite a big deployment of DNSSEC, the more vulnerable it is to these attacks, right? Because you need DNSSEC to carry out the attacks, and so the more protected a country is, the more vulnerable it is in this case. But at this point, we also want to say that we think DNSSEC is good, and I think more people should deploy it. So you shouldn't use this as an indication that you shouldn't deploy DNSSEC, just as a disclaimer. OK, now, if we see this huge impact that this attack could have, of course, we couldn't follow our normal disclosure procedure. We couldn't just send out an email describing the attack, maybe sending a proof of concept, and then very much hoping for a high CVSS score. This wouldn't cut it this time because we just couldn't risk this leaking to someone and then someone exploiting this. And so we decided to use a multi-stage process for the disclosure. We initially disclosed to a few key experts from the community, who then assembled basically a task force of the most important and trustworthy stakeholders from the community, which were mostly the operators and the developers of DNS software. And then we worked with them to develop patches against these attacks. And this took a couple of months, and it was an iterative process. So they would develop a patch, then send it to us if they thought it might work, and then we would test the patch, see if it works, and see if we can somehow circumvent it, which happened a few times. So we took a few iterations until finally we had patches which completely mitigated the attack and consisted of multiple countermeasures. And to illustrate this process, I brought two examples. And the first example is a patch that was quite early in the process. And the idea of this patch is to limit the amount of validations that the resolver is willing to do per request, which is a very good idea. The problem was that the DNSSEC resolvers of today are quite complex. So it's not as straightforward as you might think where to put this in the code. And it turned out that in this patch, it wasn't put at the right location, and so the resolver was there was still a lot of load on the resolver if the attack was running. So this wasn't sufficient. If we now look at a much later patch, this patch implements the same countermeasure, limiting the amount of signature validations that the resolver is willing to do, and they implement it correctly. The problem is that we didn't only have this attack. We also had variants of the attack, and we also had a variant that didn't use signature validations, but instead used hash computations, which can also have collisions, so we can also cause a lot of load with the hashes. It's not as much load as the signatures, because hashes are more efficient, but still a lot of load. And with this hash trap attack that we called it, we were still able to DOS this resolver, even though it was patched. But then, in the end, this was also patched, and then in the end, we finally had resolver patches which totally worked, which totally mitigated the attacks. And with this, let's come to our conclusion and the lessons learned. Now, the first conclusion is that the KeyTrap attacks that we showed allow for a comprehensive DOS on any DNSSEC resolver that we tested. So we assume the majority of DNSSEC resolvers because we tested all we could find. And this vulnerability is not an implementation problem. It's not the fault of the implementations because it's in the standard. It's in the RFC. And the RFC, I mean, people writing RFCs are not stupid, right? They know what they're doing. And they put in these requirements to ensure availability. I mean, Elias already hinted at this. They put this in because they wanted resolvers to try everything they can to resolve a domain. And for example, if you have colliding keys, the resolver should just try all of them to ensure it finds the one that works and can resolve the domain. But all of these requirements put on the resolvers in the end led to so much load on the resolvers that it in the end compromised availability. So it basically hurt itself in its confusion. And the final conclusion and takeaway that we have is that when writing specification, when writing RFCs, the impact on resource consumption must be considered. And that is not only in specific requirements, which is also important, but also in the combination of requirements. So always thinking about how could one requirement in combination with others lead to a lot of load, for example, on resolvers or on other software, for that matter. And what we also found in this example is that generic warnings are not sufficient. So the DNSSEC standard also had a generic warning saying, yeah, you shouldn't put too much load when resolving a domain. But clearly, this is not sufficient, because if you have requirements, especially must requirements, people will implement them. They are supposed to do. And so just having this generic warning, you can't expect developers to, with each code line they write, think about how this generic warning could apply. Right, and that's it. Now we're at the end of our presentation. If you have questions, then feel free to ask here. Or if you want to have more technical insights on this, we also wrote a paper which has a huge QR code here. So it was published at CCS, so if you want to read it, then feel free to scan the QR code. Thank you.
Thank you so much for thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. I'm curious a little bit to hear more about the bug or the feature with the not resolver that generated that the results that you've shown. I'm also curious to hear about the obvious potential to use this for amplified DDoS attacks. So this could you only mentioned this in passing with regards to using ad serving networks and measurement networks. If you could elaborate a little bit about that. Thank you kindly.
Thank you.
Okay.
Should I start with the not thing?
Yes, please.
Okay, so if I have it in mind correctly, it was basically a decompression problem. So they implemented a big enough buffer, which was 65 kilobytes, which is correct. But the problem is that the message is compressed, so it decompresses a little bit, and then it goes over the buffer, basically. And that was the problem. And
was there a successful result?
Yes. Yeah, so they resolved this, yeah. They basically issued a patch then. And the second question you can answer, maybe?
Second question regarding service. Okay. So the question is, what exactly is the target of the DDoS attack in this case? So we have an attack on DNS resolvers, and in that regard, we don't do traffic flooding or something like this. This is just, in the simplest case, 64K transmission, twice, two of them. So we have an attack on DNS resolvers, and you could also flood them with requests to keep them busy and by that degrade the service. And in that regard, these cryptography extensions, DNSSEC, serve as an amplifier for this attack on the resolver itself because it ramps up CPU resource consumption, keeps threads busy and stuff like that. But with regards to like reflection attacks on some links or something, overloading them, this is a different scope, so a different story. We're here attacking DNS resolvers themselves by means of overloading the CPU.
That's understood.
Yeah.
You had one slide where you mentioned the potential to use this with ad delivery network and internet.
Oh yeah, that was to reiterate on that, the slide we put up with ad networks and measurement networks was meant to show that the attacker can scale up the attack, not just attacking a single resolver by targeting a single one, but actually just indifferently just hit out and spray the internet with a lot of these requests to then cause a large-scale attack on many resolvers online, and by that eventually degrade or completely deny service to all their clients.
Hey, great work. Thank you. It seems like almost all the DNSSEC validation type problems are on recursives. Are you aware of any work on non-recursive DNSSEC validation problems or DOS attacks?
Oh, actually, recursive resolvers is just one aspect of our research. We have in our paper more. We investigated validation libraries, zone checkers, for instance, which some domain operators or some deployments actually run on zone files. So we had one provider which we had a short look at, which actually allows their customers to upload arbitrary records. And then provided they also check the DNSSEC of the zone, then you could denial of service essentially their interfaces for uploading records.
But if I'm running just an authoritative server doing DNSSEC validation, I'm pretty safe.
So DNSSEC validation is usually a thing of validators downstream, not the authoritative cells. Yeah. So if you're running just the authoritative server and you're not checking for the validation
and they're querying all they're getting their static records, there's no real computation occurring at the authoritative server.
Yes, so the malicious records are queried from the attacker name server, so no benign or innocuous name servers involved here.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, if no more questions, then thank you. And
thank you very much.
up to the next speaker.